San Diego Air and Space Museum, and we're here to discuss today the satellites that were used to download photography from space, basically advanced reconnaissance, and that would be Aurora, Gambit, and Hexagon. And I will shortly introduce Rick Deutsch, who will talk about all three of those. Our discussion is going to feature the development of enhanced surveillance from the beginning to the end of Hexagon program, which returned film from space. We call it Galileo to Hexagon. This is the Hexagon program, which we'll get to in a minute. This actually begins back around 1600 when Galileo is thought to be the first person to use the telescope. He didn't actually invent the telescope, but he was the first one to actually use it. The picture here to the right, I think he's checking soccer scores at a nearby stadium. The next to the telescope was actually patented, and some say invented, by a fellow from the Netherlands named Hans Lippershey. Over time, the telescope was developed, and it was very, very valuable in military operations. This famous picture of Washington crossing the Delaware, you can clearly see he's got a telescope in his right hand. Further from that, you have General Robert E. Lee. The thing about Robert E. Lee that is important is you see his telescope there. What's important about this is the fact that he did not have the enhanced observation that he needed. What they used at that time was the cavalry. And this gentleman here, Jeb Stuart, J.E.B. Stuart, he was a cavalry officer, and he was assigned by Lee to scout the Union troops. Unfortunately, he could not get around all the troops because of a battle, a skirmish he became involved in, and the result was that Lee could not see on the other side of this copse of trees. And you can see it's still standing, the trees are still there with an explanation. Because Lee could not see in back of the copse of trees, he did not realize there were about 9,000 to 10,000 Union soldiers. It was that hidden also, and so he launched his attack, which is also known as Pickett's Charge. As they came up the hill over the 700 and some odd yards, they were basically decimated by the Union troops. At the time, they were still using cavalry, and unfortunately, the cavalry horses were decimated by barbed wire, which stopped the horses, and machine gun fire. The British had about 18,000 horses they sent, and they lost almost all of them, until finally people looked up in the air and decided maybe a better idea would be to use observation from higher altitude. And here we have a gentleman to the left hanging from a balloon. Barrage balloons were all over the front. And finally it went to aircraft. And you see here, the gentleman is using the camera. And this allowed them to see the troop positions. There was about 2,000 miles of trenches all over the place. And they could also, from the air, aim artillery. You're a little bit long, or a little bit short, a little bit left, a little bit right. And moreover, they also used pigeons. This is Lieutenant Pigeon here. This is the U.S. Navy they had 1,500 pigeons. I actually found out his first name is actually Homer, just in case anybody wondered. After that, the problem with the pigeons were, although they're very fast, they fly 50 miles an hour, the pilots were trained to release pigeons. They would drive to what they wanted to see, release the pigeon would not fly straight back. The problem with that was the troops on the ground were trying to shoot the pigeons down, which resulted in a couple of things. They could intercept the intelligence and provide lunch for the fellows on the ground. Further from there, we go to World War II. Things have now progressed, so they're using aircraft to overfly various and sundry military positions. There was one story of a fellow I interviewed some years ago, and he was flying the recon aircraft. At that time, it was a Hellcat. And a camera he would fly over before the battle, and he would fly after the battle. Apparently the guys were not happy on the ground when they came back for the second pass. But one of the things that happened with the film they developed, they discovered on the ground those guided missiles. There were was it Baku? I think it was the name of it. They were being developed and brought out of the cage. He didn't see it, but they discovered it in the photography they had. And the next mission they had was to go and bomb those facilities. So that's why there were so few of those flying bombs that they had. Then go forward from that, and we go to Werner von Braun, 1947. You know, Werner von Braun came from Germany. He was one of our people that we brought. He suggested at that time that they use the satellites to spy on, you know, other Russians and the Chinese, whoever we wanted to at the time. Beyond that, we have Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight D. Eisenhower suggested to the Russians and the world an open skies project. They knew the nuclear weapons were out there, but they wanted to be able to overfly the area on the other tide, overfly Russia, overfly China to some extent to see what was going on. There would be bases developed to launch missiles. Unfortunately, Khrushchev did not agree with that, would not sign the treaty. In 1958, Sputnik overflew the world. This was a major shock to everybody at the time, and they realized that if you can get things into space like that, they might be able to get missiles into space. And from there, they developed, because of the Eisenhower approved the U-2 project, and at the same time, he approved the use of balloons. And this is a little-known project where they've had about 500 balloons, 500 launches. This is out of Holland, New Mexico, and where they were testing them, but then they actually flew them out of Germany and Turkey. And they basically just took the air at altitude, flew at 55 to 60,000 feet, flew over Russia, and were recovered, usually somewhere off the coast of Japan. In 1956, they made the first recovery. The balloon dropped it, and then went into parachutes, and the first recoveries were made by aircraft at the time, using C-119s. And this was called Moby Dick, and the reason I had that on there before is I just thought it looked like Melville's Moby Dick. They had several different names for the project. Right now, we're going to go from near space to real space, and Rick Deutsch is going to begin to discuss Corona, Gambit, and Hexagon.
Thank you very much, Ron. And my name is Rick Deutsch. I'm a former captain. I was based at the Satellite Control Facility in Sunnyvale, California, about 40 miles south of San Francisco. You may not have heard about it, but it was the control center for most military satellites. And that's where we controlled the satellite we're talking about today, which was Hexagon. What I wanted to show you first off was the actual base. Sunnyvale Air Force Station had actually several names during its existence. The Satellite Test Center, the Satellite Control Facility, and later on, by 2010, it was called Onizuka Air Force Station in honor of the astronaut who perished in the Challenger explosion. This is the actual base, very small facility. Moffett Naval Air Station is just to the left. That plays a role in our story as well. To the right was farmland when this was built in the 60s. We had relay antennas out in the parking lot that would go to equatorial satellites to relay data from many programs. You can see another antenna up here. This one went to Thule, Greenland. The important building here is called the Blue Cube. The Blue Cube was that was it. No windows, tempest protected, so no electromagnetic radiation would get out. It was actually 6 stories high. Only 4 floors were used. We needed extra space for cooling for the large mainframe computers inside, as well as cabling. The administration area was here. In fact, this area was Lockheed prior to the satellite program, where they controlled the program. When the Air Force came in, we made this particular area for the administration for a normal base. We had our own power station, so we weren't on the local economy as far as electricity was concerned. An interesting point, if you see where the facility is, this is a metropolitan area right next to San Jose, Palo Alto, and other major cities in Silicon Valley that you've probably heard about. Highway 237 is a freeway, as you can see, very close to the facility. A local artery is called Matilda Avenue, also very close. This played a factor in why the facility was closed in 2014. In 2014, it was decided that the cost of living for enlisted people was very high. Officers, we didn't need to live on the base. We could get a house or an apartment. Also, you've heard of the San Andreas Fault. It's very close to here. And also, programs were being moved to Colorado Springs. That's where the facility here, functions were taken over, as well as down at Vandenberg Air Base, where these vehicles were launched from. Right after World War II, Mr. Stalin decided he wanted to take the world over to communism. Many strange things were happening with our former ally. We know the Iron Curtain. We know about China's revolution, where they became a communist country as well. The Berlin Airlift, Korea came up, the H-bomb was created by the Soviet Union, the Berlin Wall. So many factors were getting very risky for our way of democracy in the United States. President Eisenhower came into office after President Truman and the war. President Truman was focused more on the economy. The economy was very important. We had millions of soldiers coming back, needed housing, needed hospitals, needed a lot of the economy of our country to improve. He wasn't that focused on defense. Whereas General Eisenhower knew the military and the importance and the problems that could come up with our adversaries. But he knew also we didn't have much intelligence in the Soviet Union. It's a large country, as big physically as the United States. We didn't have men on the street, men in boots walking around and spying to find out their capabilities. So terms like the bomber gap came up. We had the B-52 bomber in 1952. But on the other hand, we didn't know what they had. We didn't know how many bombers they had and equipment to enter a war with. We had the bomber gap, later the missile gap, and the intelligence gap, quite frankly. So that was on his mind. We needed to improve that. The existing intelligence at the time, he thought the US might be attacked in 1955 or 56. So that's how primitive our intelligence was, needed to improve it. He said, these are the things we need to know. We need to know what the Soviets are doing for weapons development. We didn't know what they were building. We didn't know their capabilities. We also didn't know their industrial potential. One major factor in the success of World War II for the Allies was the United States' industrial capability. Automobile manufacturers transferred over to making aircraft, tanks, weapons, bullets, etc. We did not know what the potential of the Soviet Union was. So we extrapolated. We assumed that they were at the same par of us, which, as it turned out, was certainly not true. Agricultural capability was important, so we could see if they were having droughts, they were having floods, anything that would require the resources from the national government to take care of the people, which meant less for defense. And lastly, we need to create better maps of the Soviet Union. Certainly we knew the major cities, but we didn't have the fidelity such that our weapons, the bombers, would know specifically exactly where their targets would be. So these four added up into a program that he formally called Weapons System 117L. We mentioned earlier about Sputnik. Now Sputnik's function, okay, the first object to go into orbit, all it did was go beep, beep, beep. Well, like, so what? Well, it's more than a so what, because if the Soviets could launch any object up into space, they could probably launch a weapon as well. So our space program really got off the mark and started hardcore into looking at what resources we could get into space. We mentioned Wernher von Braun a little bit earlier, and the scientists were all in favor of let's get into space as one of our resources. Well, early on we had the Genetrix program that was mentioned to be Moby Dick a little bit earlier, and actually, yes, it did look like a big whale out there. But this is actually what it did. These were weather balloons, if you will, and they would go up into the jet stream, launched from Germany, Turkey, and countries like that. Over 500 were launched, and they were put in the jet stream to go around the Earth. When they went around the Earth, they had a camera at the bottom with timers on it. So when it was predicted that they would be over the jet stream over the Soviet Union, the cameras would click, click, click. They would go around the planet, and they would be retrieved by aircraft, as we mentioned earlier, and then the film would be developed. Unfortunately, about 30 of those provided useful information. The rest of them, we got great pictures of cows and cornfields. So we needed to improve on that, but that was our first go at international intelligence. We had the U-2 aircraft come out. The U-2 was a very high-flying aircraft. The pilots required a pressure suit, and it was very slow, but it could get up so high we felt that the Soviet missiles could not reach it at the altitudes it flew at. Important for us today is in the belly it had a camera. The camera was made by the same company that made the camera in the Hexagon satellite, Perkin-Elmer. You're going to hear about Perkin-Elmer and their work making the camera just a little bit later today. The resolution in this camera was 2 feet, which is pretty good. We could see objects 2 feet, and they could land very soon, get the film developed and off to the customer, if you will, which was usually the CIA, for analysis to see what was there. Well, after Francis Gary Powers got shot down over Russia, this was a big impediment to our program because President Eisenhower denied that we were ever doing that. Now he got caught. So we stopped all the U-2 flights. Soon thereafter, a new aircraft rolled out of Lockheed called the SR-71. This is still the fastest airplane created, about 3.5 times the speed of sound is what we know. It may have gone faster. But the important thing is it also had a camera in the fuselage that was made by Perkin-Elmer as well. The resolution coming back from this aircraft was less than 2 feet. So we're getting better and better and better with technology. Now, the first satellite that we're going to talk about, of the 3 that were film-based, and our Hexagon was the last film-based camera until electro-optical became in vogue. So Corona, look at the years that it went, 1960 to 72. Improvements every year coming along. Initially, you can see the image right here where we had cameras taking pictures down on the surface. In the front end, we had a recovery bucket that exposed film would be transported into, which would be ejected on orbit over the Pacific and would be caught. Again, we're going to learn quite a bit about the recovery process just a little bit later. Look at the resolution. It went from about 40 feet in the beginning, over all those years of technology improvement, down to 5 feet. Very, very good camera for the days. It was film-based. A lot of discussions with the science and the Pentagon on what should we do, film or electro-optical. It turns out film, even today, has better resolution than pixels on a digital camera. The film could be blown up so our analysts could zoom right in and see things less than 5 feet. So that's why we went with film. It's no longer used. Now, it went under a secret program of Corona, but it had a cover, which the public would know was called Discoverer. That was simply a life sciences experimental program. But underneath the blanket, it was really Corona taking classified satellites. Corona was the very first satellite to go in a polar orbit. Now, if you think about it, equatorial satellites are very useful if you want to be over the equator. If you rotate the same speed as the planet goes around, you can be over the same spot. So today, if you're at 22,000 miles out from Earth, you're going around the Earth the same speed the Earth is turning. Beautiful for weather cameras. So if you wanted to look down at your hometown, that's what you see on television, is the pictures taken from today's weather. Television as well. Television may come out of New York up to a stationary satellite and then back down to your hometown. Air recovery was used on these, very similar in technology to the earlier systems that were picking up balloons as we went on. Air recovery, there were 145 flights of Corona, 145 flights. A lot of problems in the beginning, blowing up at the pad, not going into orbit, and it finally worked. We caught one in midair, and it had film in it, which was the very first thing caught from space midair. The follow-on to that was called Gambit. And I want to point out something in the name right now, many code words that change, and it's hard to keep up with them. But Gambit, unknown what that really means, but that was the code word. Notice, it was called KH7 in the beginning. That stood for keyhole. Keyhole was the code name for satellite-based reconnaissance. Aircraft-based went under the code name Talent. Now, number 7 is said because it was improved into Gambit. They called it Gambit 3. There was a brief time period between Gambit and Gambit 3. Gambit 3 was this vehicle here. KH7 actually was the first Gambit, but we also had a recovery area for the film once pictures were taken. This is a heat shield for when it would go through the atmosphere. Later incantations had 2 of these recovery vehicles. A problem with recovery vehicles is the satellite in the early days would only stay up about 5 days to 2 weeks. Well, that wasn't bad to find out what you took pictures of. As time went on into Hexagon, we could stay up 6 to 9 months. with 4 of these recovery buckets. We'll talk about that in just a second here. But you're delayed in getting that information back to the customer, which would be the CIA. They wanted to see what was going on in the Middle East, in Vietnam, over the Soviet Union, any of the denied areas that we couldn't fly over very, very easily. And so you have the delay. And that's one reason that later on we went to the electro-optical for real-time image viewing. These were under an umbrella called the black programs. Black meant, well, the budget was not publicized, what was going on was not publicized, and many, many programs were called black. In the early days, there was a little bit of rivalry, let's say, between the CIA, which is in charge of intelligence, and the Air Force, which flies the vehicles. The very first programs were controlled by the CIA. As time went on, there was discussions, let's say, between the two. So an organization called the National Reconnaissance Office, NRO, was created kind of to be a referee between the two. And what was decided was the CIA would control the intelligence targets that they wanted pictures of. The Air Force would entail itself with the procurement of the launch vehicles, with the actual satellites that would be constructed, with the recovery teams, etc. And that's what went on through the program. This is the object of the focus of today's talk. Hexagon, KH-9 we're up to now. It ran from 1971 to 1985. We had 19 vehicles that went up. About, like I said, 6 to 9 months as the program evolved. We would be off for about 3 or 4 months when we did rehearsals. And I was an operations director, and we also worked creating commands that would be sent up to the satellite from tracking stations. This was an extremely large satellite. I want you to look at the dimensions. 60 feet long. That is longer not only than a school bus, it's bigger than a Greyhound bus, it's bigger than an 18-wheeler. This was immensely large. It was 10 feet in diameter. I took this picture at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base Air Museum. Highly recommend that you go there. This vehicle you're looking at here was never flown. This was a development machine used when we had on-orbit operations and we had anomalies, we called them. Something went wrong. So the engineers that were involved in this could actually climb inside and see what was wrong with their particular system. When the program ended, it was declassified in 2011. This program went from the late 60s during the design phase, first launched in 1971. Last launch actually was 1986. There were 20 missions planned. The last one blew up at the pad. We're going to show you a picture of that explosion a little bit later in the talk. Now, we had solar panels on the back. We had an engine in the back also that we could manipulate. We had jets that we could move it horizontally and vertically. The section here in silver, this was, let's call it the command and control section. This was the brains of the satellite. This is where the memory would be stored that we could send commands up to and other functions to control further downstream. The next section here that I'm showing you on the right side, those were film spools. Kodak made the extremely thin film that we had. There were 2 spools up here feeding 2 cameras, which you can see right down here. Our next speaker, Phil Pressel, worked at Perkin-Elmer. He was the lead engineer for the development of this very exotic camera system. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But after the film was photographed here by these 2 cameras for stereo view, that meant we could see the height of rocket gantries of buildings in these denied areas. The film would be passed through to 4 of these recovery vehicles. For demonstration at the museum, they've left 1 in here. This one is gold coated. It would have a cover of heat ablative material for re-entering the atmosphere. I'll show you that coming up soon. But there were 4 of these recovery vehicles that we call buckets. And here's one that has the shield over it. All of this again was exposed to space, so they had to be space rated. I put this other picture in for you so you can get another appreciation of the size of this. Very, very large. Again, this could have flown, but the program was wound down. It was not needed ever to fly, but it could have. I want you to look at this top left opening here. In the later missions, like the last 5 or 6, a mapper camera was put up there so we could more precisely tell exactly what we were taking pictures of. It's taken off here just for viewing of the public. Again, at Wright-Patterson, please go take a look at it. Lockheed Missiles and Space Company, which is different than today's Lockheed Martin. So this was Lockheed Missiles and Space in Sunnyvale, California. They were the integrating contractor that put all of these component pieces that came from other contractors in, and they of course had a space rating. They had 3 of these newly built chambers specifically for Hexagon, 60 feet long. Their current satellites were probably a third the size. They had to test vibrations, they had to test vacuum, temperatures, other things like that, getting ready for launch. Now, the public tended to know, the press picked up some of the information on this, because that's kind of what the media does, and it picked up the name of Big Bird. So the public and the press was calling it Big Bird, and we actually started to call that too. It was so big, Big Bird was an appropriate name. Here's a close-up picture I took of one of those recovery vehicles, and it's a pretty good shot. You can see how big it is. It's going to run 57 inches, a little over 4 feet or so in diameter. It was big. It was bigger than the buckets on the previous 2 satellites. It weighed 1,600 pounds. That was going to be a challenge when we ended up catching them. You can imagine, by aircraft towing these inside the aircraft after catching it. Amazing. I wanted to show you the contractors, the primary contractors that were involved in the Hexagon program. I mentioned Lockheed up at the top here, Perkin-Elmer we've mentioned. Kodak provided the film. The film got thinner and thinner and thinner. We had black and white, we had color film that we knew when it was going to come up, so we could accordingly take pictures of that. Occasionally, you know, we would take pictures looking down at planned targets. We took pictures of our parking lot so we could adjust the cameras to see how the focus was. At the end, we had 30 miles of film in each of those 2 containers, the spools. An amazing number, 30 miles of film. And we could keep track with the sensors on board where we were on a particular spool, knowing that maybe we're filling up a bucket ready to come down. McDonnell Douglas made the buckets underneath the belly. You can see some of the other contractors. The software was unique to this program. TRW created the software that allowed this function to take place. It was called T-Unity. It wasn't Fortran, it wasn't Pascal or any other language. This was unique. System Development Corporation was an integrating contractor for the software used at the tracking stations as well as at Sunnyvale. So you can see some of the others. Martin Company, which was not Martin Marietta at the time, they provided the Titan launch vehicles. Some of the components had to come in on a C5. The section that Perkin-Elmer worked with, the entire camera system, was put together and tested in Danbury, Connecticut. There were 1,000 Perkin-Elmer engineers, all with a clearance, to work on this. An amazing feat. Still today, it's called the most complicated camera ever made, and you'll see that when Phil gives his presentation. So some pieces had to be flown in on a C5 to Moffett Naval Air Station, right next door. Right next door to that was Lockheed. Very easy to move things at night, back and forth. When the satellite was all integrated, tested, ready to go, it was put in a truck and driven down to Vandenberg Air Force Base for launch, about 3 hours away, 3 to 4 hours away, down on the coast. It's north of Santa Barbara, pretty far north, and north of San Luis Obispo. In the background, if you can make this out on your video, that is the blue cube right there. That's one of the dirigible hangars for the Moffett. It was built in 1931 to have an 800-foot long dirigible to go out and do coastal patrol. You can slightly see on the screen here this extremely large building where that was kept. But this is Highway 101. This goes all the way down to Los Angeles from here, a major highway. But that's what we did. We get it down to Vandenberg. The very first launch of anything from Vandenberg was 1958. The first launch of Hexagon was 1971. And the other satellites were launched even prior to that. This is a modern picture. Modern picture shows you the ocean. Vandenberg is an extremely large physical base. There's many launch complexes there. I have to tell you, it's usually foggy down there. When I've seen a launch, you could see great the plume for about 1.5 seconds, and then it went into the clouds. Then you could hear the rumble about 30 seconds later coming out to you. So there's many of these, and these launched the Hexagon satellites. In 2019, President Trump designated the U.S. Space Force, another branch of the Department of Defense similar to the Army and Navy, Marines, etc. So it's now called Vandenberg Space Force Base. They're cranking up still parsing out responsibilities. That was December of 2019. I wanted to show you the launch vehicle. It's a Titan 3D, very powerful rocket. It had the solid rocket motors that you'll see even today used for launches. Keep in mind this is 60 feet long. So in reality, the upper portion here is the Hexagon satellite. On the right side, I wanted to share something also, as well as the title of this slide, the Byman Control System. We were not under the umbrella of the Department of Defense classification system, unclassified, confidential, secret, and top secret. We were under the Byman Control System that you can see right in the center right here. All of our documents that were passed around, all our computer output, had control by the Byman system, Hexagon. And we were secret for this particular cover sheet. The Byman system was unique to this world we're talking about here. It also was declassified. 2011 is when Hexagon was declassified. Look how many years that would be, from the late 60s until 2011. We could say nothing. We couldn't say these initials we're talking about, couldn't say CIA, etc. Keyhole, I wanted to mention again. So Keyhole, again, was the umbrella program. So you will see many of these satellites, even the earlier ones, Keyhole 3, Keyhole 4, and the successor programs. These names are changing. They've changed all the time to throw off the people snooping into our programs. Now I want to tell just a little bit about polar orbiting. I talked about equatorial orbits, but we would launch here from Vandenberg on the west coast. We'd go due south, so if something happened, it would fall into the ocean, and we wanted a polar orbit. These are traces of the satellite going around, and so we could indeed cover the entire Earth with a polar orbiting vehicle. About 90 minutes to make a pass. So in time, the life of this program, we took pictures of the entire planet Earth. Those photographs are released. Not the high fidelity ones that were even lower than 2 feet. And they're shared with the geographical folks. What they're doing now is comparing. What did the glaciers look like in 1975 compared to today for global warming studies? So it is still useful information that's coming back to the taxpayers. Now I also wanted to put up our 6 tracking stations with these red stars, and I'll tell you exactly where they are in just a moment. But the point of this is we needed to send commands up to the satellite and receive telemetry down as often as we possibly could. And we had to do tracking runs so we would know where the satellite would be in the future. Very important to know where it is, exactly the altitude and the speed that it's going at. So you can see some of the passes would go right through a tracking station, and the tracking station would be in contact with Sunnyvale, the satellite control facility, and it would lock on to the satellite. If it was passing right overhead, it would have a long time of visibility. So it would be easier, minutes would go by. If it was on the fringes, for example, one over here, well, it would be low on the horizon. So they would acquire it at a very low altitude, and it would only be in contact for literally a couple minutes. So at that time, we had to get commands up and data back down. Scheduling was very important. We used 6 tracking stations, and there were maybe, I guess, 9 or 10 different compartment programs. Again, we were cleared for our program, so I really can't elaborate more on what was going on elsewhere. But we had 6 tracking stations that had to be parsed out to the various programs. Some were equatorial, some were different altitudes. We were at low orbit, 100 miles up. 100 miles up. You can imagine the clarity you'd get closer to the Earth. There's a lot of air molecules at 100 miles up, so we took care of that, explain that a little bit later. This is colored paper tape up here. This man is on a very long piece of, well, butcher paper, and you can see the horizontal lines perhaps, showing where the tracking station is and what programs wanted to use the dish so they could put their satellites up. We were luckily very high priority, so we tended to bump people off. Some of the tracking stations had 2 antennas, so we had an A side and a B side, and we could share those. So when he was done with that, they would take a look at the various programs to see how they were doing, and then this information would be coded and sent out to the various programs. So we needed to know scheduling. Okay, resources had to be scheduled for the tracking stations for our team, so we know what was going. Since I was a captain, I was on a junior officer team, 4 officers. We worked 12 hours a day shift, come in at night shift, do that for 4 days in a row, then another team of 8 officers would come in. And we would do this for about 9 months. Once the satellite came down, we were off, about 3 months. It was great. go where you wanted to go. But we did rehearsals quite a bit. The whole team, all the contractors, and we would do a pretend and see what happens. They'd throw problems in and how we would correct them. This is what we did a lot of. This is how we prepared the commands. Key punch cards. These go back to Herman Hollerith and IBM, and that's what we used at the time. So we could sit down here and type our commands in. What were we typing in? Things like any on and off switches we wanted the satellite to turn on and off for various reasons. Any recorders we wanted to record, not the pictures, but other components on board. The battery life, we may want to charge it, turn it on, off. The orbit adjust. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of air molecules 100 miles up. So it would gradually start to sink back in. We would have to, every 3 days, boost it with the thrusters that were on board to bring it up. Now it stayed horizontal over the planet the whole time with the sensors that we had to keep it horizontal. But we had to do that. We also, any updates that might be required. So the junior officer team in command generation, we would sit down with key punch cards and type, put our little holes in it and get our stack. Well, going on at the same time, the CIA was in the building, and what they would do is they were now in their office looking specifically what they wanted pictures of, the exact longitude and latitude. They'd also have inputs and such things as weather. We didn't want to take pictures of cloud cover, so they would have to get that data. They also needed to know the tracking information, specifically to know how high it was going to be, the speed it was going at, etc. So what they would do is they'd walk across the hall with an Air Force representative, it's an Air Force program, with their deck of all the targets they wanted. We would take it and integrate it into our deck. We would take this big pack of computer cards, walk out to a dedicated mainframe computer. Back then, in the 70s, a Control Data Corporation 3800, and there it is. It's a similar model. I couldn't take pictures of the actual one. But you can see the tape drives, you can see the operator here. We would load our deck in there. The computer would deconflict anything that was not appropriate. We may have to run it again until it ran good. Not very powerful. As we got into the 1980s, all this was taken out in a data system modernization program with laptops and desktop machines. So that's how fast the technology has changed. In the early days of this program, the early 70s, this was all new, very plush. You can see the gentlemen here, not Air Force officers at this time, but perhaps Lockheed people. Nice cushy chairs, mahogany wood, big screens. So they were enjoying themselves. By the time I got in the mid-70s, this is what we used. So character-based terminals that would read down during an actual pass. This is an actual pass going on. To the companies that made their components. There would be 2 or 3 rows behind them with other people watching their screens to see if the temperatures were good, etc. You'd notice the Air Force officer down to the left. I did that as well. This is an Air Force program. We were in charge. We did have a technical advisor company called the Aerospace Company, and these were senior scientists that, quite frankly, would help us out quite a bit, so we would perform our job adequately. But the officer was in touch with the tracking station. It was his command to transmit the commands up. If there was a problem, one of the gentlemen that worked with one of the companies would say, I got a problem with XYZ, and we needed to send an emergency command up. The officer would approve that. If we had anomalies, yes, they occurred. After the pass of, could it be just a few minutes, the telemetry would come down and be printed out, and we would get tracking data at the same time. We would go to a separate room and explain what the problem was. The whole team would get together, Aerospace would kind of lead the technical discussion, and then we'd come up with a solution. Okay guys, next pass we're going to send command 2702. That'll correct the overheating or whatever the situation was. Every 90 minutes, which it took the satellite to go around in an orbit, Sunnyvale woke up again, and what we would do is, with our antennas in the parking lot, go up to an equatorial military satellite, which would bounce the signal back down to one of the tracking stations. And this tracking station would store the commands in its particular computer system. And then, like I said, during the actual pass, we'd all be on the horn together to make contact and transmit the command. I did want to share with you the 6 tracking stations. At the Vandenberg Air Force Base then, we had 2 antennas. In Thule, Greenland, we had 1 antenna way up there for when we could pick up information rotating north-south up there. The Seychelles Islands, which is east of Africa, tracking station there. We also had one in Hawaii on the main island at the top northwest corner. It's still there today. It had 2 antennas. New Hampshire physically is where it was. We called it Boston. Its code name was Boss. And we had Guam. So those were our 6 stations. Other satellite tracking stations were elsewhere for other programs. This is what we used religiously for our antenna system. This little drawing here illustrates in a compressed manner exactly what the mission was. So bear with me here on this. What you see right here is the satellite being launched from Vandenberg, and Sunnyvale is in touch with our tracking downstream stations, ships for example, to know where it was going right away. It'd get into orbit, okay? And of course the first stage boosters would be dropped off. It would go into orbit. It may go around a few times, and when it was ready for the first contact, we in Sunnyvale would send commands out to the tracking station. Like I said earlier, when a pass occurred, there's the transmission up and down. Maybe 2 orbits later, not right away, it would take a picture of the surface. And not only could we look straight down and get images that were less than 2 feet, we could also do wide swaths up to 370 miles. And that's how we mapped the entire Earth. After we took our pictures, sooner or later it was time to bring the film down. So what we would do is turn the rocket around to slow it down a bit. We'd eject off the capsule from the front, made sure that it wouldn't hit the satellite. It would continue down, and at 50,000 feet, a parachute would open. Bear with me on the next slide. What we would do when we ejected it out of the vehicle, we would spin it up to stabilize it, okay, to get it rotating. Then we would move it away from the main body to get it away. We rotate it the other way to stabilize it. At that time, the rocket would be ejected. Now we would have the heat shield covering the film in a canister underneath. It would come through the atmosphere, similar that you've seen to the Mercury and Apollo, etc. The parachute drogue chute would come out first, and there's the bucket, we called it. And then later it would pull out the main chute. The main chute would open up, and we had an auxiliary chute, which our next speaker is going to explain to you. And then it would be caught midair. By the time our satellite program came around, it was C-130s. Earlier on, we're going to hear about C-119s that were doing this. So that's what was done at 15,000 feet. This would occur. It would be snagged and then reeled in. Okay? What I'd like to show you now is an actual recovery. I've got video for you. I want you to take a look at this. This is actually at Hickam Air Force Base near Honolulu. It actually shares the same runway as the commercial airport at Honolulu today. It's right next to the airport there. But these are the C-130s that were involved in the recoveries. You can see them on the flight line there, getting ready to take off. Because now when we ejected it, we commanded it to go over the Pacific. Our recovery group, which is part of our hierarchy of an organization, okay, there it is coming down. They would be ready. It has beacons on it. So we would know where it's coming down. 5 C-130s were sent out. The reason is they're going to try to catch it. If the first one is unable to, the second one is lined up, the third one, etc. That's a command ship that was in contact with the beaker going on to kind of oversee the whole operation. Helicopters would be available if frogmen should land in the water. Now you can see the aircraft with their hooks dragging behind, locating it, and sometimes it was hundreds of miles away. So the aircraft could be positioned elsewhere to try to get it. And here we are coming straight at it now, the lead aircraft, and others are prepared should it miss. And they rehearsed this a lot. So here we go, actual footage, and you can see the parachute being snagged, a little like marlin fishing. There's the parachute going into the back of the plane. There's the bucket dangling. Parachute goes in. This is inside the aircraft. You can see it at the bottom. Parachute going in, and then the cabling going down. Okay, now, did we catch them all? Well, of the 20 missions that were made, one of them sank. The 20th rocket blew up, so there was not any buckets that we could catch on that. Out of the 80 possible buckets, they caught 68 of them. Okay, some were water recovered. One of them hit the deck. It went down without the parachute functioning. It hit the water at multiple G's, let's just say. Very, very rough. Water's like concrete when you're coming down at these any sort of altitudes. Went down and stuck on the bottom at 16,000 feet. But the customer, the CIA, really wanted the pictures that it took because we knew where the pictures were taken. and it directed that we go get it, okay? So what happened was the Trieste deep diving submersible was recruited. It took about 3 months for this program to actually attempt. They had to find it, first of all, at the bottom. The Navy was involved, there were rehearsals done. Perkin-Elmer, the same camera company, was contracted to make a hook that would be lowered from the Trieste and grab the actual container. I want to point out that it's gold. The heat shield was ablative, it was the white, but underneath it, when it came down, was gold for heat protection. Gold is very thermally oriented to provide the heat protection other than other materials, and it was gold. So it picked it up, the grappling hook worked, and as they were pulling up though, it kind of tinkled apart from being down there and the impact that it had. As it got to the surface, film was just flying down, unusable. And actually when it was right below the surface, it was directed to be covered up with a tarp. Even the crew on board the ship didn't know what was in there. They knew they were picking up something, okay? Now, unfortunately, no useful film came out of it, but this is pictures taken on the bottom. And it was just, well, just a mess. But we tried, we did it, we recovered it, so we would get credit, I guess you could say, for.
Okay, so
Are there any questions I could help with?
how much did this cost for these 3 projects?
It's in a black program. The costs are very still protected, but I'd say on the order of maybe 2 to 3 billion for all 12 satellites and the infrastructure. There were contracts let for big money. Yeah, so I'd say, you know, a couple billion.
So this should be compared to the Hubble telescope, because the Hubble telescope started flying in 1990, and one of the pictures I saw on the internet compared the size, oddly enough, just like a school bus.
Well, interesting if I could comment on that. We don't have clearances for anything beyond Hexagon, so anything that I would say is speculation. The follow-on program is, I'd say, partially declassified. The NRO is releasing thousands of pages on these programs, and that takes a lot of time to figure out. But it was called Kennen, was the successor. It actually flew right at the end of our particular program, and it was cameras. It was real time. And if you read the literature, it was basically the Hubble telescope pointed down to the Earth. So that's my knowledge of that. Speculation. Now, you may ask what was the resolution that we could get out of Hexagon. Officially, it was under 2 feet. Better than that, we can't tell you. Speculation on the other succeeding systems, which you can read an open literature if it's correct. They could see a golf ball. Not only could they see that golf ball, they could read Titleist on the golf ball. It's amazing what's happened in 40 years in the interim time. You know, so thank gosh that we can do this. The Russians also have a system. They're very smart people. Ours are generally way ahead of theirs, of course. Chinese, everybody's launching rockets now to the moon, to Mars, Israel. You know, it's just everybody is going up there now.